Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel. L'miyas Hashem. Today we will be learning Daf Kuf Nun Ches Amud Beis. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today on the very top line of Kuf Nun Ches Amud Beis, Siman Shin Chaf Hey, in the midst of Siv Zayin, and we're at the very first words of Kuf Nun Ches Amud Beis in the Mechaber, V'yesh Oimrim. Our learning should be a schus for Achenu Beis Yisrael, Hanasunim Batzara Bashivya, Ha'imdim Bebayam Ubein Bayabasha, Hamakim Yerachem Aleim, V'yetziam Yitzara Lervacha Me'afelu La'ira Mishibud L'Geula, Hashta Bagalo V'zman Kariv V'naimar Amen. Our learning should be a schus Refuah Shalema for Yitzchak ben Tzion ben Dusha, Rivka bas Shirlea, Chav Hadassah bas Serel, and Yehoshua Levi ben Ahuva Malka Chana. They should all have a Refuah Shalema B'sar Shar Chayla Yisrael. The Torah learning of Klal Yisrael should be a schus. The Rebbeinu Shalom should watch over and protect every member of Klal Yisrael. B'chol makayim shehem. So, here in Siman Shin Chaf Hey, we have been discussing for the last few seifim the question of what happens when an Eini Yehudi does malacha on Shabbos. What is the status of the product of that malacha? Is the Yisrael allowed to make use of the product of the Meleches Isser done by an Eini Yehudi or not? So now, in Sif Hey, the Mechaber told us that if an Eini Yehudi picks peiros for himself on Shabbos, so an Eini Yehudi goes over to an apple tree on Shabbos afternoon and he picks some beautiful ripe apples. Why is he picking them? Because he wants to eat them. All right, he eats a couple of the apples, but there are some apples left over. And now we have a Shiloh. He offers some of them to Ruvain, to Shimon. Ruvain and Shimon, are they allowed to eat these apples? The Mechaber in Sifei told us that the apples are osir, and they're osir to all Yisraelim for the duration of Shabbos. Why are they osir? They're osir because of the Isra of Muktzah. It really has nothing to do with the fact that the Eini Yehudi did malacha on Shabbos, or I shouldn't say it has nothing to do with it, but they're usher for a wholly independent reason, and that is the Yisr of Muktzah. These apples were mechuber, they were attached to the tree at Ben Hashmoshes when Shabbos came in, and therefore they were not available for use during the Ben Hashmoshes period, and we know the rule, migudis katzoyle Ben Hashmoshes is katzoyle kula yuma. So since the apples were in a state of muktzah during Ben Hashmoshes, those apples are osir for the duration of Shabbos. Not only can Ruvain and Shimon not eat them, Ruvain and Shimon also are not allowed to be metaltal them. No one is allowed to move, eat, or anything with those apples for the duration of Shabbos, simply because they are muktzah. Now, in that case, we were dealing with a case where the Eini Yehudi picked the apples for himself. Then in Sivav, the Mechaber changed the case. In Sivav, the Mechaber taught us the halacha. What happens if Tony, the Eini Yehudi, picked the apples not for himself? He picked the apples for Yisraelim. He picked the apples for Ruvain. That's why he picked the apples. Well, in that case, the Mechaber tells us, now we have a new problem. First of all, yes, the apples are going to be osir on Shabbos. Again, they're going to be osir because they're simply muktzah. But now, not only are the apples going to be osir on Shabbos, the apples are going to remain osir on Motzei Shabbos until the Zman of Kidei Sheyaseh. They're going to remain osir on Motzei Shabbos until enough time passes that Tony could have gone to the apple tree, picked the apples, brought them to you. Why? Because we can't be neneh. Since we know that Tony did this malacha on behalf of a Yisrael, now there's a din d'Rabbanan that a Yisrael is not allowed to have hana from that malacha that the Eini Yehudi did on Shabbos. How do we avoid having hana from the malacha? Well, what we do is we say that the apples are going to be osir until such time passes after Shabbos that theoretically the guy could have done everything that he did on Shabbos. He could have done it on Motzei Shabbos. So now, by the time I get my hands on that apple and I eat that apple, I'm really no longer being neneh from the fact that he did the malacha on Shabbos, because by this time he could have done it after Shabbos as well. So that was Sif Hey, that was Sivav. What we see from Sif Hey and Sivav is that the critical difference between the Eina Yehudi picking the apples for himself or picking the apples for Yisrael, the difference is going to be Negeya to Motzei Shabbos. The difference is not Negeya on Shabbos. On Shabbos, it doesn't matter if he picked it for himself or he picked it for the Yisrael. Either way, the apples are muktzah. So either way, the apples are going to be aser on Shabbos. The question of whether or not whether he picked it for himself or whether he picked it for Yisrael is really germane to Motzei Shabbos. If he picked it for himself, so then on Motzei Shabbos it's mutter, because since he didn't do the malacha for a Yisrael, we're not geyser, and we don't make a gzeira and say you can't have hana from that malacha that he did on Shabbos. It's only when he did the malacha for a Yisrael, then we aser it even on Motzei Shabbos. Why? Very simple. Because when an Eina Yehudi does malacha for Yisrael, if we're going to allow you to gain the benefit of that malacha immediately when Shabbos is over, so now there's a very strong temptation either on Shabbos to go tell an Eina Yehudi, look, do your malacha already, do your baking already, because I want to eat a donut right after Shabbos is over. And we don't want that to happen. And also, if you're going to see that you could reap the benefit of malacha that an Eina Yehudi did for you on Shabbos, then there's always going to be a temptation to ask an Eina Yehudi to do malacha for you on Shabbos, which is also because of Amir La'akim. Okay, now that brings us really to the end, to Sif Zayin. We covered Sif A, we covered Sif Zayin, Sif Vav. Now, in Sif Zayin, the Mechaber presented us with two cases where we're dealing with a suffix. In case number one that the Mechaber gave us, he told us a case. What happens if we know that the Eina Yehudi picked the apples on Shabbos? So, okay, right away, since we know that the apples were picked on Shabbos, we know that the apples are muktzah. And we know that the apples are going to be aser for the duration of Shabbos, and they're going to be aser to all Yisraelim for the duration of Shabbos, simply because they're muktzah. But now we have a suffix. What's the suffix? We don't know when the Eina Yehudi picked the apples on Shabbos, did he do it for himself, or did he do it for Yisrael? What's the nafkamina? Very simple. That's Sif Hey and Sif Vav. If he picked it for himself, so it becomes mutter the second Shabbos is over. If he picked it for Yisrael, it remains aser on Motzei Shabbos until b'chdei sheyasa. So that's the first case. The Mechaber paskins that the apples, of course, are aser on Shabbos because they're muktzah, but he also goes l'chumra on Motzei Shabbos, and he says that the apples are also going to be aser on Shabbos. Since we have a suffix that maybe he picked them for Yisrael, and if he picked them for Yisrael, they're aser on Motzei Shabbos, we go l'chumra, and we say we have to worry that maybe he picked them for Yisrael, and therefore they are aser on Motzei Shabbos. That was suffix number one in Sif Zayin. Then the Mechaber came with suffix number two, really the opposite case. The Mechaber says, how about in this case? What happens if we know for sure that the Eina Yehudi picked the apples for Yisrael? Our suffix is, we don't know if he picked them on Shabbos. We don't know if he picked them on Shabbos or he picked them Erev Shabbos. Oh, so now, if he picked them on Erev Shabbos, they're mutter legamri. They're mutter on Shabbos. They're mutter after Shabbos. Why should they be aser? If they were picked on Erev Shabbos, they're not muktzah. There's no problem with being nene from the malacha that the guy did. So again, we know that he picked it for Yisrael, but we don't know if he picked it on Shabbos. He might have picked it on Erev Shabbos. If he picked it on Erev Shabbos, it's mutter legamri. If he picked it on Shabbos, well, then on Shabbos, the apples are also because they're muktzah, and on Motzei Shabbos, they're aser ad b'chdei sheyasa, because the Meleches Isser was done for Yisrael. Once again, the Mechaber paskins l'chumra. He says we have to worry that the apples were picked on Shabbos, and therefore on Shabbos they're aser and they're muktzah, and we know that he picked it for Yisrael, and therefore they're aser on Motzei Shabbos ad b'chdei sheyasa. So in both cases of suffix of Sif Zayin, the Mechaber goes l'chumra. The Mishnah Berurah explained to us, Why are we going l'chumra? The reason we're being so machmir, and it's really very strange in a certain way, because we're dealing here all with Isurei Derabanan. Muktzah is an Isur Derabanan. The Gzeira to asa the apples on Mosi Shabbos ad b'chtei sheyasa is a din Derabanan. So why are we going so l'chumra? The reason we're going so l'chumra is because in all of these issues, we're dealing with apples that eventually are going to become mutter with the passage of time. And therefore, we're dealing with something which is a davar sheyesh lo matirin. And we know already from the halachas of bittul, from Yeridea, that when we're dealing with something which is a davar sheyesh lo matirin, just like we're very machmir, and in Hilchis Yeridea we say afilu be'elef lo bottle, we never employ bittul to be matir a davar sheyesh lo matirin. So too over here, we're not going to go ahead and use the mechanics of Sveika D'Rabbanan Lakula to turn around and say we should be makel and we should make the apples mutter. No, we're going to go l'chumra and we're going to say they're aser on Shabbos, they're aser on Motzei Shabbos, and you'll eat the apples when they become mutter. Now, today, we turn to Kuf Nun Ches Amud Beis, and now we're going to see an opinion that's more makel. Says the Mechaber, V'yesh Oimrim de la'erev muter miyad. We have a sheet over here. This is a smag that's quoted by the Torah. The smag's opinion is that b'negeya to the shaila on Shabbos itself. Now, in which one of these cases did we have a shaila on Shabbos itself? Not in the first case. In the first case, we were dealing with apples that we know are picked on Shabbos. So on Shabbos, the apples are absolutely usher. There's no tzad to make them mutter that were picked on Shabbos. So they're muktzah. In the first suffix, there was only a shaila on Motzei Shabbos. The shaila was, did he pick it for himself? Did he pick it for a Yisrael? If he picked it for himself, the mutter on Motzei Shabbos. But if he picked them for a Yisrael, then they're also on Motzei Shabbos. This smag says that in that case, we're going to be makel, and we're going to say that they're mutter on Motzei Shabbos. And even in the second case of Suffolk, we know that the apples were picked for Yisrael. The shaila is, were they picked on Shabbos or not? Well, on the tzad that they weren't picked on Shabbos, they would be mutter legamri. This smag agrees that they're going to be aser on Shabbos. On Shabbos, we're going to go l'chumra, and we're going to worry that the apples might have been picked on Shabbos, and they're going to be aser. But on Motzei Shabbos, we're going to be makel. So look at what's happening over here. In the second case of Suffolk, what exactly is the shaila? In the second case of Suffolk, we know that the apples were picked for Yisrael. The suffix is were they picked on Shabbos or not. So we have two shailas. Shaila number one, what's the din on Shabbos? We have a suffix. If they were picked on Shabbos, they're also because of muktzah. If they weren't picked on Shabbos, they're mutter. They're mutter legamri. Says the smag, like the mechaber, we go l'chumra. We have to worry that they were picked on Shabbos, and therefore on Shabbos they're aser. Now we have shaila number two. Shaila number two is Motzei Shabbos. What's the halacha of these apples on Motzei Shabbos? We know that they were picked for Yisrael, and you just told me that on Shabbos we go l'chumra, and we're chayshish that they were picked on Shabbos. Well, let's do the math. If we're being chayshish that they were picked on Shabbos, and we know that they were picked for Yisrael, then they should be also on Motzei Shabbos until b'chtei sheyaseh. Yet the smag says no. Anytime we're dealing with a shaila on Motzei Shabbos, we go l'kula. On Motzei Shabbos, we're going to say that they're mutter. The second Shabbos is over. Even though on Shabbos we're asering these peiros because we're being chayshish that they were picked on Shabbos, and even though we know that they were picked for Yisrael, b'negeya to the shaila on Motzei Shabbos, we're going to be makel. So this smag holds that in both of the sveikis of the beginning of Siv Zayin, on Shabbos, we're going to aser the peiros. But on Motzei Shabbos, we're going to say that they're mutter miyad, they're mutter immediately when Shabbos is over. Now, obviously, we have some splaining to do over here. So let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Lamed Gimel, on Kuf Nun Ches Amud Beis, says the Chavetz Chaim. V'yesh Oimrim de la'erev mutter miyad. This smag says that on Motzei Shabbos, they're always going to be mutter immediately when Shabbos is over. Explains the Mishnah Berurah why is that? The Sfira Lahu, because these Shitas hold to like Asir Rabbanon Bazem Isfeika, that the Chazal would not answer these pairs on Motzi Shabbos out of a suffix. Okay? Umikol Makom, nevertheless, B'Shabbos Gufa, but on Shabbos itself. Now, again, at the risk of being overly repetitive, realize that in the case of the first Shiloh of Siv Zion, over there we have no suffix on Shabbos. Over there we know that the pairs were picked on Shabbos. So they're definitely muktzah and they're definitely usher. The only Shiloh that we have that's negayah to Shabbos is in suffix number 2. Suffix number 2, we don't know if the apples were picked on Shabbos at all. But since it's a Shiloh on Shabbos itself, we're going to go l'chumra, we're going to be chayshish that they were picked on Shabbos, and we're going to asa them. So again, says the Mishnah Berurah, umikamaka b'Shabbos gufa, when the Shiloh is on Shabbos day, the isura mishum muktzah, over there we're dealing with a suffix of muktzah. Moidu de'ein lahater, over there the smag is maskim that we cannot go l'kula and we cannot be mater these peros by saying, oh, maybe they were picked before Shabbos. Afilu heicha derask suffik im nilketu b'Shabbos. Even though we only have a suffix that they might have been picked on Shabbos, we have to go l'chumra. Why? The besufik muchan, because when we're dealing with a suffix of whether something is muchan, whether it's prepared for Shabbos use or it's muktzah, hechmi we're very machmir mishar sveikos d'Rabbanan than we are by other sveikos d'Rabbanan. V'chanal b'sivhei. Why? Because it is a davar sheyesh loy matirin. Okay. Now, I have to pause here for a second, because again, I think the smag needs a little bit more explaining, a little bit more speaking out than the Mishnah Berurah really did here, and I'm going to focus on the second case of suffix. So again, in the second case of suffix, the case over here was, we know that the apples were picked for Yisrael. We don't know if they were picked on Shabbos or they were picked before Shabbos. So let's isolate the two shilohs. We have one shiloh that's the negayah to Shabbos day. The shiloh that's the negayah to Shabbos day is, all right, are these apples muktzah or are they not muktzah? If they were picked on Shabbos, they're muktzah. If they were not picked on Shabbos, they're not muktzah. Okay, so this is a shaila of suffik muchan, suffik muktzah. Muktzah is a davar sheyesh lo matirin. Therefore, even though this is a sveika d'Rabbanan, we're not going to go l'kula. We're going to go l'chumra, and we're going to say that the paras are also on Shabbos. Okay, so Yankel came to the Rav to ask the Rav the shaila on Shabbos. He wants to know, am I allowed to eat the apples on Shabbos? The Rav told him, no, it's a suffik muchan, suffik muktzah. The apples are also on Shabbos. Okay, now he comes back by Ma'ariv on Motzi Shabbos, and he goes and he asks the Rav, remember those apples that I asked you about, where we had a suffix? We know that Tony picked them for me, but we don't know if he picked them on Shabbos or on Erev Shabbos, and this afternoon you told me that they're usher, because it's a shaila, suffix muchan, suffix muktzah. Now I want to ask the Rav a new shaila. I'm going to daven Ma'ariv, and one of those apples are here in Shul. I want to know if the second Shabbos is over, I can make a Bari Priya Eitz and I can eat that apple, or do I have to wait ad b'chtei sheyeyaseh? Turns around the Rav according to the Smag, and the Rav says, on Motzei Shabbos, it's mutter immediately when Shabbos is over. Turns Yankel, and he goes to the Rav, and he says, that's very strange. You asked the apples on Shabbos because you told me that I have to be chayshish that the apples were picked on Shabbos. All right, so I didn't eat the apples this afternoon because I was worried that they were picked on Shabbos. Now I know that they were picked for me. Well, 1 + 1 = 2. If I have to be chayshish that they were picked on Shabbos, and I know that they were picked for me, then they were picked for Yisrael, they should be also on Motzi Shabbos ad b'chtei sheyeyaseh. How are you telling me that the mutter the minute Shabbos is over? The answer is that on the Shaila on Motzi Shabbos, over there we could be makel. Why is it that we're makel on that, but we're machmir by the suffix muchan, suffix muktzah? In both cases, we're really dealing with something which is a davar sheyesh lo matirin. So what exactly is the nafkamina between these two shilos? In both of these shilos, we're dealing with an issa d'Rabbanan, and we're dealing with a davar sheyesh lo matirin. And yet you're telling me that by Shabbos day, we have to be machmir, and we have to be chayshish that they were picked on Shabbos, but Motzei Shabbos, I could eat them immediately after Shabbos. The difference is, in the nature of these two dinei d'Rabbanan. On Shabbos, it's a suffix whether the apples are inherently osir because they're muktzah, or maybe not. Maybe they were picked before Shabbos, and they are not inherently muktzah because they're inherently osir because they're not muktzah. Really, they're muchan. Over there, we have to go l'chumra. Because since it's a suffix, is it inherently osir or is it not? And it's a davar sheyesh lo matirin. Over there we go l'chumra. But the nature of the shaila on Motzi Shabbos is a different shaila. On Motzi Shabbos, there is no tzad to say that the apples are inherently osir. There's no muktzah on Motzi Shabbos. The only reason the apples would be osir on Motzi Shabbos is because of gzeira d'Rabbanan. What's the gzeira d'Rabbanan? The gzeira d'Rabbanan is, if we're going to allow you to eat these apples, the second Shabbos is over, so on a certain level, you're being neneh from Meleches Isser that was performed by an Eini Yehudi for Yisrael on Shabbos, you might come to do Amir La'akum. That's not a shaila whether or not the apples are inherently osir. That's a shaila on gzeira d'Rabbanan. When it comes to a shaila on gzeira d'Rabbanan, even by a davar sheyesh lo matirin, the smag holds you could be mekel. Okay. That is, I think, largely the most complicated part of today's shir. Let's finish off Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Lamed Gimel. Uladina, as far as halacha l'maisa, what do we do here? We have this machlokes, the first opinion in Sif Zayin of how to handle these suffix situations, and the smag who's more mekel. Uladina kasav El Yerabah damashma mi'achrayim. The El Yerabah says that it's implied from the words of the achrayim, the yesh lismaich ala yesh oimrim hazeh, that we could rely on this yesh oimrim and we could be mater these peros Motzi Shabbos miyad. De'ein lahachmir l'motzei Shabbos. Aval b'chayadav kasav de'ein lahakal rak l'tzarech mitzvah. V'chein mashma me'esh al Avram sif katan yud tes she'ein lahakal b'zeh. V'shekein ichriya habeis Yosef b'simin tov kuf tes vav. Okay, now we're going to move along to Sif Ches. Now, in Sif Ches, once again, we're going to be discussing the question of an Eini Yehudi doing some form of malacha on Shabbos, and now we have the question of us, of a Yisrael, gaining the benefit of that malacha on Shabbos and on Motzi Shabbos. But the huge difference between Sif Ches and what we were talking about in Sif Hey and Sif Vav and Sif Zayin is that in Sif Hey, Sif Vav, and Sif Zayin, a very big driver of the equation was the Isser of Muktzah. We were talking about fish that were caught on Shabbos. Fish that were caught on Shabbos are Muktzah, because during Ben Hashmashos, they were swimming happily around in the river. They weren't available for Shabbos use. Migudis katsoyle Ben Hashmashos is katsoyle kula yuma. The apples that were b'mechuber, the apples that were attached to the tree during Ben Hashmashos were muktzah during Ben Hashmashos. Migudis katsoyle Ben Hashmashos is katsoyle kula yuma. They remain muktzah for the entirety of Shabbos. So when we did the math in Sif Hey, Sif Vav, and Sif Zayin, we always had to take the question of muktzah into consideration. But here in Sif Ches, we're going to talk about a situation where there is no Isser muktzah. Let's take a look here at Sif Ches. Says the Mechaber, Davar she'ein boich shash tzeda u'mechuber. Let's say we're talking about a shaila where we're not talking about fish that were trapped. There's no shaila here of tzad. We're not talking about an Eini Yehudi who did melecha daraisa, like tzedra on Shabbos. We're not talking about mechuber. We're not talking about apples that were on the tree that the Eini Yehudi picked on Shabbos. In those cases, we have an issue of muktzah. Ella, now we're talking about a different case. Ella shehuva michutz l'tchum. Now the problem that we're dealing with is that an Eini Yehudi brought apples from outside of the tchum. Now, we know that these apples were not picked on Shabbos. How do we know? We could tell by the way they're shriveled. We could tell by how overripe they are. We know that these apples were not picked on Shabbos. So we have no shaila of muktzah. During Ben Hashmashos, these apples were not muktzah. They were already off the tree. So it's a food. Food is not muktzah. So over here, there's no shaila of muktzah. What's the problem? The problem is that the Eini Yehudi still did malacha on Shabbos. What did he do? He brought something from outside the tchum. Now, that's an Issa D'Rabbanan. According to most Man Yarmur, according to where we paskin, that's an Issa D'Rabbanan. He brought something from out of the tchum, so he was over in Issa D'Rabbanan. So he did Malacha D'Rabbanan. Says the Mechaber, Davar she'ein b'ch shash tzeidah u'mechuber. If we're dealing with something where there is no Isser here of tzeidah or toilish, ela shehuva michutz l'tchum. The problem is that something was brought from outside the tchum. Now again, the critical point over here is that now in this discussion, there's no tzad of muktzah. The apples are not going to be also because they're muktzah. They're not muktzah. So now says the Mechaber, it depends. If the guy brought these apples for himself, so now, before I even read weiter in the Mechaber, let's do the math. All right, an Eini Yehudi did malacha, in this case, malacha d'Rabbanan. He brought something from out of the tchum, and he did not do it for Yisrael. He did it for himself. So on the basis of what are you going to aser these apples? You can't aser them because of muktzah. There's no tzad muktzah here. So forget it. Muktzah goes out the window. On what other basis are you going to aser these apples? You're not going to tell me that I can't use the apples on Shabbos because I can't get hana from the malacha that the Eini Yehudi did. That's only true when Eini Yehudi does malacha for Yisrael. But if he did it for himself, then you're allowed to get hana from that malacha. So there's no basis over here to aser these apples at all. So the Mechaber says, mutter afilu b'yom. So these apples will be mutter even on Shabbos. So again, what was the first halacha here of Sivches? We have an Eini Yehudi brought something that is not muktzah. He brought apples that were already taken off the tree before Shabbos. He brought them from outside of the tchum, and he did it for himself. And now he meets you, and he offers you an apple, but he didn't bring it for you. He brought it for himself. Says the Mechaber, those apples are mutter legamri even on Shabbos. Go ahead, make a bar pri'etz, and chomp down on a beautiful, crunchy, delicious apple, because there's no reason to aser them at all. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Kat Lamed she'ein b'ch shash. We have no chash over here that these apples are muktzah. We have no chash of mechuber or of tzeidah. Kigayin, for example, says the Mishnah Berurah, dvarim acherim she'ein shaych b'hem tzeidah lekita. We're not talking about fish, where we could be talking about tzeidah. Let's say we're not even talking about apples, that you have any shaila of toilish. We're talking about chocolate. Right? So he brought you a box. He didn't bring you. He brought for himself a box of chocolates from outside of the tchum. So, okay, there's no tzad of muktzah, there's no tzad of tzeidah, there's no tzad of toilish of mechuber, bahani, or even if we're talking about something like apples. Or we could tell that these apples were not picked on Shabbos. The Mechaber says these chocolates or these apples would be mutter, 100% mutter. Hainu af ba'achila. You could make a shahakal and chow down on the truffles. You can make a bar pri'etz and you could eat the apples. Now, the truth is that there is something that needs to be explained over here, and that is, we did have a yesh oisrim in Sif Dalid. In the case where an Eini Yehudi baked bread for himself on Shabbos. So we had a yesh oisrim that said over there that when the Eini Yehudi bakes bread for himself on Shabbos, we have a yesh oisrim that says that the bread is aser. And one of the reasons that we brought down for that yesh oisrim is because we're afraid that if an Eini Yehudi bakes bread for himself on Shabbos and we let you eat some of that bread, you might come on another Shabbos to ask him to bake bread for you. Now, l'chayri, you could make an argument that yesh oisrim should aser these chocolates that the guy brought from out of the tchum also. But says the Mishnah Berurah, no. Even that yesh oisrim would not aser the chocolates over here. Why? Because be'isr tchumin shari. Because you have to remember that when we're talking about a guy who bakes bread on Shabbos, we're talking about a guy who's doing malacha daraisa on Shabbos. He's not being over, he's a guy, but he's performing the av malacha of mevashel on Shabbos. That's malacha daraisa. Over there, we're going to be more machmir. Over here, by a guy who brought a box of chocolates from outside of the tchum, We're dealing with a din derabanan, so we're going to be more makel. Not only that, says the Mishnah Berurah, v'af betchumin d'shnei mil. Even if we're dealing with a box of chocolates that were not only brought from outside of the tchum is 2,000 amos outside of the city limits. But let's say these chocolates were brought from a much greater distance away from the city limits. They were brought from 12 mil outside the city limits. 12 mil is 24,000 amos. Now, there are those Rishonim that hold that the tchum of Yud Beis Mil is an Issa Daraisa. So, says the Mishnah Berurah, even in that case, even if the box of chocolates were brought from outside the tchum Yud Beis Mil, we would still be makel. Why? I now dealing with a daraisa. Yes, it's true. According to some Rishonim, we're dealing with a daraisa. But it's a weak daraisa. What do I mean, a weak daraisa? There's no such thing as a weak daraisa, chas v'chalila. What I mean, I'm saying it relatively. What I mean is, yes, it's a daraisa, but it's not mefurish bikra. It's not a din daraisa that has a direct source in the pasuk, in the Torah, and therefore it's considered somewhat of a weaker Isser Daraisa, and we would still be Makel. Okay, so that was the first halacha of Sivches. Again, the first halacha of Sivches, you have an Eini Yehudi brought a box of chocolates from outside the Tchum. Over here, there's no tzad of an Isser of Muktzah. The only problem over here is that the Eini Yehudi did Malacha Derabanan on Shabbos, but he did it for himself. And since he did it for himself, there's no reason to asa this box of chocolates at all. It's 100% mutter. It's mutter ba'achila. It's certainly mutter b'tiltel. It's 100% mutter. Now, halacha number 2, second line down, a little bit past the halfway point, says the Mechaber, now let's tweak the case a little bit. Let's say the guy brought the box of chocolates not for himself. He brought it for Ruvain. He brought it for Yisrael. Oh, well, in that case, we have a problem. Because now we have Malacha D'Rabbanan that was performed by an Eini Yehudi, and it was performed for a Yisrael. In that case, says the Mechaber, mutter l'taltel, you're allowed to move the box of chocolates. Why? Very simple. Because the only way you could ask it to tiltel is if you could give me an argument that they're muktzah. But there's no reason that they should be muktzah. It's a box of chocolates. Box of chocolates aren't muktzah. So mutter l'taltel, afilu mishahuva b'shvilai. Even the one that the Eini Yehudi brought the box of chocolates for. So Tony brought the box of chocolates for Ruvain. Even for Ruvain, the chocolates are 100% mutter b'tiltel. They're non-muktzah, so he could accept the box of chocolates and he could put it up on a shelf. Avalechol, however, to eat the chocolates, aser by b'yayim lemishahuva b'shvilai. It would be aser to eat the chocolates for the one that the Eini Yehudi brought the chocolates for. So if Tony brought the chocolates for Ruvain, Ruvain could take the box of chocolates and he could put them on the shelf. Or he could take the box of chocolates and he could bring them next door to his good friend Shimon, his neighbor. Because Shimon is allowed to eat it, but Ruvain is not allowed to eat it. Why? Because since Tony did Meleches Isser Midrabanan on Shabbos for Ruvain, Ruvain is not allowed to have benefit from that malacha. He cannot go eat it. He could give it to somebody else. He could be metaltal it, but he cannot eat it. V'la erev b'chtei sheyeyasu. And since the problem over here is that Meleches Isser was done for Ruvain, and we're asering that hana, therefore, that Isser is going to extend to Motzei Shabbos. They're going to remain Asser on Motzei Shabbos until this man of Kidei Sheyeyasu. Now let's see some Mishnah Berurah over here. Says the Mishnah Berurah, ice cotton, lamid vav. Mutter l'taltel. Well, why not? There's no Muktzah over here. We're not talking about something like fish that were trapped on Shabbos so that they were Muktzah during Ben Hashmoshes. We're not talking about apples that were attached to a tree during Ben Hashmoshes. We're talking about a box of chocolates. There is no Isser Muktzah here. Now, even though you might want to come and you want to make an argument to me, you might want to tell me, well, they should be Muktzah because they have no Shabbos use. Why do they have no Shabbos use? Because the primary use of chocolate is to eat it. and Reuven's not allowed to eat it. So maybe you want to tell me that for Reuven, these chocolates have no Shabbos use, and therefore they should be muktzah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no, that's an invalid argument. Kevin Shali Yisrael Acher Mutarin, you can't go and say that these chocolates are inherently muktzah. Any other yid is allowed to eat it. Ein aleim she muktzah, you can't call them muktzah, the haruyim li Yisrael Acher, because another yid is able to use it. Eis kalam zayin, aval lechol aser, but to eat the chocolates would be aser. For who? For the one that Tony brought them for. So if Tony brought them for Reuven, they're aser ba'achilu to Reuven, but they're mutter ba'achilu to everybody else. Now, we're going to see that it's not true that they're mutter to everybody else. We'll see that in the Mishnah Berurah in a moment. But right now, the Mishnah Berurah says a cute chap. How about if what happens is like this? How about Tony comes knocking on the door, and he has two items. He has a box of chocolates, and he also has a box of taffies. And he tells Reuven, I brought you a box of chocolates. Shimon, I brought you a box of delicious saltwater taffies. Okay, so now Reuven's not allowed to eat the chocolates, because Tony brought them from out of the Tchum for him on Shabbos. Shimon is not allowed to eat the saltwater taffies, because Tony brought them for him from outside the Tchum on Shabbos. Oh, but I have a great idea. You know what? Reuven and Shimon could do a trade. Reuven should give Shimon the chocolates. Shimon will give Reuven the saltwater taffies, and now everybody's happy. Everybody has a Shabbos party. Are you allowed to do that? Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. They would not be allowed to swap them so that each one has something that's mutar ba'achila for himself. Because if that would be mutar, once people would see that that's mutar, so then they would start asking Einam Yehudim to bring them things from outside the Tchum. Because what do you mean? There's a very easy way to be matter them. But to sell it, if Reuven wants to take the chocolates and he wants to sell it to his neighbor Levi, that would be mutter. Now, how's that mutter? How are you allowed to sell things on Shabbos? Explains the Mishnah Berurah in the brackets. In Siman Shin Chav Gimel, we discussed how you could sort of make transactions on Shabbos. You can't mention price, you can't mention measurements, etc., etc. But there are ways that you essentially could affect a transaction that you'll complete after Shabbos. That would be mutter. However, you can't really turn a profit. So if Tony brought you the chocolates from outside the Tchum, and it's not that he brought them to you out of the goodness of his heart, he brought them for you from outside the Tchum because you ordered them from him on Wednesday. On Wednesday, you ordered this box of chocolates, and you paid him for the box of chocolates, but he delivered it on Shabbos afternoon. So you paid for these. Now, if you want to make an arrangement to sell them to Levi, yes, you could make an arrangement and you could effect a sale, but you can't make a profit. Why? Because by making a profit, you're benefiting from the fact that they were brought to you now, and you have them now to sell it so that you could turn a profit. And that profit you're not allowed to make, because then you're benefiting from the malacha that Tony did for you on Shabbos. The Mechaber said that the chocolates are going to be aser ba'achila to the one that Tony brought them for. Now that sounds like there's only one person that these chocolates are going to be aser to, right? Tony brought them for Reuven, they'll be aser to Reuven, but they'll be mutter to everybody else. Says the Mishnah Berurah, not so fast. Later on in Hilchas Yom Tov, we will learn in Yirtzeh Hashem, to hu adin libnei beisai da aser. They're not only aser to Reuven, they are aser to all of the people of Reuven's household. They're even aser to his guests. Ayin Sham Mishnah Berurah, exactly what kind of guests. Okay, let's make the case a little bit more complicated. Let's say Tony brought chocolates to town on Shabbos afternoon, but he didn't bring them for a specific person. He is a traveling salesman, so he brought 10 boxes of delicious kosher chocolates to town on Shabbos afternoon, and now he's putting them up for sale. Now, he didn't bring them specifically for the Jewish population. He just brought them to sell them. Im hevi limkar be'ir sheruba Yisrael. If he brought them to a city where most of the population are Yidden, asur l'kol, it is asur to everybody, because the b'shvil kulam hevi, because we look at it as if he brought them for every single Yid in the city, because that's what he really did. He brought them to the city to be available for purchase to everybody. And since it's a city that's roiv Yidden, he brought it for all the Yidden. But if he brought it to a city where most of the population is Einam Yehudim, then they would be mutter. V'dain, you should know. Here we're going to have a very interesting halacha, which is a halacha in Hilchas Tchumen that Mir Hashem will see in Chelik Daled. So let me just give you a little bit of a hakdama. There are really two different isurim when we talk about the isur of Tchum Shabbos. One isur is you are not allowed to travel outside of the Tchum Shabbos. So the Tchum limit is 2,000 amas from the city limits. You're not allowed to travel beyond that 2,000 amma limit, because then you are traveling outside the Tchum. Then there's another isur, and that is every person, every item it receives a designated place on Shabbos. In halacha, we call that being kind of shvisa. When Shabbos kicks in, the tchum of every person and the tchum of every item is measured by where they were located when Shabbos came in. On Shabbos, you're not allowed to transport anything outside of its tchum. And once an item arrives, if somehow an item arrives outside of its tchum on Shabbos, you're not allowed to move it more than Dalet Amas from where it is located. So let's say you have a shopping bag full of apples. And now on Shabbos, a goy goes ahead and transports that shopping bag of apples outside of its tchum. Well, then, on Shabbos, you're not allowed to move those apples more than 4 amas from where the apples were deposited. Because once they come from outside of the tchum, once they travel outside of their tchum, now they're not allowed to be moved more than Dalet amas away from where they are presently located. Now, that's very high level. So, for example, if something comes from outside of the tchum and it's deposited inside your house on Shabbos, you're allowed to move it more than 4 amas because you could move it throughout your house. But if it's outside, you can't move it more than Dalet amas. Again, this is very high level. The nitty-gritty of this we'll have to get into in Chelik Daled. Now, here's a very interesting halacha when it comes to the halacha of Tchumen. And that is that the halacha of Tchumen is really dependent upon ground travel. And what I mean by that is, when we say that you're not allowed to go out of the tchum, that's only when you're traveling within 10 tfachim of the ground. But if you could travel above 10 tfachim from the ground, and I'll give you a very simple way that can happen. If you're in a boat and the bottom of the boat is more than 10 tfachim elevated off the riverbed or the seabed, which 99.9% of the time that's going to be the case, then when you're traveling, we don't see you as traveling outside of the tchum. However, there's a little bit of, and the same thing would apply, let's say, to a sack of apples. So now let's take a look here inside the words of the Mishnah Berurah. It says the Mishnah Berurah like this: V'day, you should know, De'emuhuva b'svina l'mayla me'asara shari. If an Eini Yehudi brought something by boat, and the boat was consistently more elevated more than 10 tfachim off of the riverbed, then this is going to be mutter. Then you're not going to have a shiloh over here where you're going to have this shiloh of sivches, oivei, the guy did malacha d'Rabbanan because he brought something from outside of the tchum. No, he didn't, because he was traveling more than 10 tfachim elevated above the ground. And therefore, we don't look at it as he traveled outside of the tchum. De'ein tchumin l'mayla me'asara. Vayim is Siman Tav Daled, and you will see the nitty-gritty of this in Siman Tav Daled. Tahainu shaloi haya be'abasha be'ben hashmashis. There's a wrinkle in this, and that is, it has to be that the item that he brought, so let's go back to our box of chocolates. And now, before I even read it inside, let's say the box of chocolates was sitting on the ground, or was sitting in a house during the Ben Hashmashis period. Well, in that case, that box of chocolates was kind of shvisa on Ben Hashmashas when Shabbos came in, wherever it was sitting on during the Ben Hashmashas period on Friday evening. Now that box of chocolates has a tchum. Where's the limit of its tchum? 2,000 amas outside of the city limits. Okay, now on Shabbos, a goy takes the box of chocolates, puts it in a boat, and travels by boat, and the bottom of the boat is elevated more than 10 tefachim off the riverbed. Now, it's true that while he's traveling, we don't look at him as traveling outside of the tchum. And even if this was a Yisrael, we wouldn't say that the Yisrael is being over the Isser of traveling outside of the tchum, because he's not traveling by ground. He's traveling more than 10 tefachim elevated off the surface of the earth. So we don't look at it that he's traveling outside of the tchum. But now when the boat docks and they take that box of chocolates and they put it down on Shabbos, guess what? The fact is that that box of chocolates is now outside of its tchum. Right? I mean, just what's the reality on the ground? The box of chocolates is no longer within its tchum. It left its tchum a long time ago. So yes, nobody was transporting it outside of the tchum because the act of transportation was done more than 10 tefachim elevated off the seabed. Aber l'maisa, when the box of chocolates gets put down on Shabbos afternoon somewhere, it is now located more than 2,000 amas outside of its tchum. And since it's now located more than 2,000 amas outside of its tchum, you're not allowed to move it daled amas. It has to be that never at any point. So even, let's say, if this box of chocolates was already on the boat during Ben Hashmashas, right? But then, if at some point Friday night, there was a very shallow part of the river, and now the boat was within 10 tefachim of the seabed, then at that moment, the box of chocolates is going to be kind of shvisa. And now, even if the boat starts riding up high again, lamaisa, when it reaches a dock, it's going to be more than 2,000 amas outside of its tchum, and you won't be allowed to move it more than 4 amas. If the Mechaber said that in this case that we're dealing over here with this box of chocolates, if Tony brought it for Ruvain on Shabbos, it's Asr Ba'achila to Ruvain on Shabbos, and it's going to be Asr on Mosi Shabbos as well until the Zman of B'chtei Sheyeyasu. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katlam Tes B'chtei Sheyeyasu. How do you measure B'chtei Sheyeyasu? Hakol Lefi Inyan. You have to look at every case individually. Shanasa Balacha B'Shabbos. You have to look at how the guy performed the Balacha on Shabbos. Im Hevi Ha'eni Yehudi Derech Rechiva also. If the guy brought you the apples, he brought you the box of chocolates on Shabbos, and from outside the tchum, and he was riding on a horse. So because he was riding on a fast horse, it only took him a half an hour. Okay, so then the malacha that the Eini Yehudi did of traveling outside the tchum on Shabbos was a half hour. So now on Moshe Shabbos, you have to wait a half hour. Now, you don't turn around and say, well, it only took him a half hour because he was riding a fast horse. If he would have been walking, it would have taken 4 hours. So maybe B'chtei Sheyeyasu was 4 hours. No, you look at it the way the guy did it. Now let's say this guy brought you the box of chocolates and he brought it from a very far away place. So he was traveling for 3 days to bring you the box of chocolates. B'chtei Sheyeyasu doesn't mean that you have to wait on Motzei Shabbos as long as it took him. No, it's only that you have to wait on Motzei Shabbos for the amount of time that he did malacha on Shabbos. So we don't care that he was traveling Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. We only care about the time that he was traveling Friday night and Shabbos day. If you don't know where he came from, we always have to worry that it came from outside of the tchum. Okay, we didn't quite finish. We'll stop over here. We'll continue next time with the Ramah. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. So limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rosh should send Yeshua Serfus Parnas and Shidduchim to all those in need. We should be zeicher to see the Biaskel Tzedek. B'meher v'yameinu amen. Be well.